This video was brought to you by Incogni. Last year, we did a whole load of videos on Turkey's long-running economic crisis, which was basically caused by President Erdogan insisting that the Turkish central bank cut rather than raise interest rates in the face of rising inflation. In part because Erdogan apparently considers interest rate hikes to be un-Islamic. As orthodox economists predicted, this policy stoked inflation and weakened the lira, which went from trading at 5 lira per dollar in 2019 to about 26 in May of last year. Anyway, we stopped making those videos a few months ago because a month after winning re-election in May, Erdogan quietly installed an orthodox finance minister and central bank governor, who promptly raised interest rates. Everyone, including us, sort of assumed that this would eventually bring Turkey's economy back to normality. But unfortunately for Erdogan, that's not what's happened. In fact, despite extraordinarily steep rate hikes to a new high of 45% last week, the lira has continued to decline and inflation has actually increased. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Turkey's ongoing economic crisis, why it looks worryingly unfixable, and what Erdogan might do next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, let's start with a quick recap. The lira began declining around 2018, but this slide accelerated rapidly after the pandemic, when inflation ticked up across the world. Usually, central banks hike interest rates in order to reduce inflation, but Erdogan claimed that interest rate hikes are some sort of un-Islamic conspiracy advanced by what he describes as the interest rate lobby. So, instead of raising rates, he cut them instead. While Erdogan might have believed this, his cuts were probably also motivated by the fact, as much of the world knows by now, interest rate hikes cause real economic pain, even if they do eventually bring down inflation. To get his way, Erdogan fired any central banker who dared to oppose him, and interest rates duly fell from 19% in late 2021 to a low of 8.5% in early 2023. Unsurprisingly, these low interest rates only devalued the lira further, which in turn pushed up inflation, which peaked at 85.5% in October 2022, with unofficial estimates putting the true number at about double that. This put Erdogan in a difficult spot ahead of last year's election. The lira was declining fast, pushing inflation to politically unpalatable highs and crippling ordinary Turks' purchasing power. Erdogan knew that the orthodox solution to this, raising rates, would be politically embarrassing and risk pushing Turkey into recession. So instead, Erdogan kept rates nice and low, but burnt through billions of foreign exchange reserves in order to exchange the lira at about 20 per dollar. Essentially, Erdogan told the Turkish central bank to spend billions of dollars and euros buying up the lira on international markets, which artificially inflated its value. This is a practice known as defending your currency, and while it can work for a short period of time, it's very expensive and fundamentally unsustainable. Once he won the election though, Erdogan quickly U-turned, appointing Mehmet Şimşek as finance minister and Hafizegaya Erkan as central bank governor. Now, both Şimşek and Erkan were considered safe hands. They both made it clear that they disagreed with Erdogan's unorthodox monetary policies, and they both spent a lot of their careers at big Western banks. As expected then, they started to raise rates soon after being appointed. But unfortunately for Erdogan, and Turkey more generally, this hasn't worked. In the 8 months since they came in, they've raised rates from 8.5% to 45%. That's obviously astonishingly high. For context, the Fed and the Bank of England have both currently set their rates at slightly above 5%, but it still hasn't been enough to bring down inflation, at least not yet. After falling steeply in the first half of 2023, year-on-year inflation in Turkey has actually been rising for the past few months, hitting a new 12-month high of 65% in January, with month-on-month inflation coming in at about 3%. The lira has also continued its decline, passing 30 lira to the dollar in early January. For context, before the pandemic, the lira was trading at about 6 to the dollar, and in 2017 it was trading at about 3 to the dollar, which means that the lira has now lost 90% of its value in the past 7 years or so. Now, we should say that in their latest statement, Turkey's central bank's policy setting committee said that they still expected inflation to come down eventually, citing, quote, the lagged impact of monetary tightening, and promising to keep rates high for as long as they needed. International investors have also begun warily re-entering the Turkish market, and in a recent HSBC Emerging Markets survey, Turkish bonds were highlighted as a preferred investment for the first time in years. Nonetheless, in a tacit admission that things aren't going to plan, a couple of days ago the central bank quietly announced that it was resorting to unconditional measures, i.e. not just interest rates, to try and make the lira more attractive for ordinary Turks. Essentially, after years of lira depreciation, many Turks have just started using other currencies like dollars, which in turn has reduced demand for the lira and therefore made it even less valuable, creating a currency doom loop. So, what actually happens next? Well, a lot here depends on the price of oil, which in turn depends on the situation in the Middle East. Turkey is a big energy importer, so if the price of oil goes up, that'll only stoke inflation further. And if there's anything we've learned over the last few years, it's that an increase in energy costs can quickly spiral into an increase in inflation across the board. In this light, Erdogan is probably hoping that the situation in the Middle East, where Turkey buys a lot of its oil from, calms down soon. Perhaps the crunch point will be the local elections on March 31st, when Turkey is due to go to the polls to vote for mayors across the country. And these are a pretty big deal for Erdogan, because he lost both the Istanbul and Ankara mayoralties to the opposition in 2019, and he's since vowed to win them back. So, if the rate hikes are proving unpopular, Erdogan will be tempted to reverse them in order to give himself a pre-election boost. Because while Erdogan has mostly backed his new finance minister and central bank governor, in December he went against them and raised the minimum wage by nearly 50%, stoking inflation and demonstrating that, at the end of the day, Erdogan probably cares more about electability than macroeconomic stability. Anyway, if the rate hikes are proving unpopular ahead of the March elections, Erdogan will be tempted to reverse them, or at least go for some inflationary giveaways, as he did before last year's election. What you've been learning about Turkey's economic issues in this video, you might not realize that shady forces are working in the background to collect personal data from various sites and bundle it together, ready to sell to a third party. These data brokers can sell this bundle of information about you to anyone from a company to an online criminal. Now, you might assume that you're safe online. Perhaps you change your password regularly. Or perhaps you're a hawk and always uncheck the box that signs you up for annoying newsletters. Unfortunately, though, this doesn't completely save you. Companies that hold your data can still fall victim to a data breach, meaning that those data brokers can still compile information about you to sell on to others. And this is where our sponsor, Incogni, comes in. They reach out to those data brokers on your behalf, request that any data is removed, and deal with any problems that might arise. In fact, they're tenacious and will put in multiple data removal requests even after your data has been removed to ensure that it never goes back on the market. So create an account with the link in our descriptions, grant Incogni the ability to work on your behalf, and sit back as they make you safer. Plus, if you use our link, you'll get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. Thanks for checking it out, and thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this video.